Now that I'm all caught up on the maintenance of the F-250 while I was waiting on parts for the 1970 Mercedes, it's time to circle back and get back to working on this Mercedes. It's a 7280 SE, and I made a video a while ago about, I think it was called Exploratory Surgery, about the problem that I found on it. And the in summary, the left rear caliper was seized, and that caused the rotor to glow cherry red. So I've got it all taken apart here, and it took me a while, but I've got all the parts ordered and they came in. I did decide to go ahead and rebuild the caliper, and I'm currently working on that right now. You know, during inclement weather and things like that, when I have time. I've got the two pistons removed. It is a fixed caliper instead of a sliding caliper, and the pistons look to be in really good shape, which is nice. That was one of the main things I was looking for. I think I can go ahead and reuse these versus buying a new caliper. The chrome surface is in really good shape. And the problem is that on the outer side, or outer edge of that, you can see where the corrosion was. The seals were totally gone and dried up, allowing water to get in there. This ridge right in here is where one of the seals was, the inner seal. It's the outer dust boot that actually failed, and that caused a lot of corrosion to get in there. And the piston basically got pushed out to a certain position and froze there, and that caused the problem. You can see some of the pitting there. So it's not perfect, but I think I've gotten it smoothed out with some 320 grit sandpaper and just spending some time with it. This caliper is ready to be blown out with compressed air, and I'll go ahead and put the seal kit in there, and I'll make a separate video for that. I've got all the parts that I need. I'm going to go ahead and replace all the hoses on the car, both the front and the back. I've got two front brake hoses. I've got axle shaft seals and the brake caliper seal kit, as well as the brake shoes, and also some brand new EBC brake pads, the EBC green stuff, which is exactly like the pads I had before. Unfortunately, the pads that I had before were destroyed when the rotor got cherry red. But before I can do any of this and finish up with the calipers and get those installed, I've got to fix another problem that was exposed when I took off the rear drum to investigate what was going on. And as you can tell, everything is just greasy and coated with oil. So that slowed me down a little bit. I was basically down but not out. It's just going to complicate matters a little bit, because what I have to do is take off the parking brake shoes and then slide this axle shaft out of here, and then see what's going on with the outer seal and inner seal that's located farther down the axle tube. And this car, being 42 years old, I guess now 43 years old, is actually pretty modern, because it's just like a lot of new cars where you've got basically a disc drum setup. You've got a drum in the top hat of the rotor for your parking brake, and as well as the braking disc outer surface for the service brake. And that basically makes for a bona fide, true, separate braking system. Unlike a lot of other cars where they have drum brakes that serve as the parking brake and the service brake. So anyway, to get started, disassembling this, what I've got to do is take out that spring right here first, and then take out this retainer spring and that retainer spring down there, and basically spread the shoes apart and work them out over top of the axle shaft. I do have a specialized tool for working on drum brakes, but I'm not sure that this tool is going to work on this car, but I've got it as a standby. Primarily what I use is a combination of long nose pliers and long nose needle grip pliers, vice grips. So I'm going to basically work the pliers up on that spring like that, lock them down, and lift the spring out, and I'll show you what happens next. Okay, that wasn't so bad. I got the spring out over here, and I've got it oriented in the same position that it was when it came out. And one of the tricks you can use when working on drum brake type systems, because they seem to be a little bit more complicated than the disc brake systems, is to do just one side at a time. That way, if you forget how it went back together, you can go to the other side, which is still assembled, and see how the parts fit together. On the axle flange here, you've got a larger hole here compared to all the others, and that's basically an access hole that you can work one of the ends of your tool up into and to get that spring out. Unfortunately, the angle is not great enough to, or actually the angle is not optimal to go ahead and get that spring out, which I was afraid of. So what I ended up doing, and there's the end of the spring, is just using some needle nose pliers here, kind of like that, and you reach in through here and you push in the spring and turn it 90 degrees. So now what we'll do is we'll rotate the axle again to be close to where that other spring is, and we'll work our pliers up in there. You can see on the other side how that's going to work, and it generally takes two hands. These springs are very powerful, so I have to put the camera down, but you kind of get the idea. You're going to push in with the pliers and turn 90 degrees, and then the brake shoe should come right on out. Okay, so now that we have the shoe return spring removed and the two retaining springs removed, the parking brake shoes are basically ready to come on out, and I'll set the camera down and try to demonstrate that. Just spread the shoes off of the mechanism toward the bottom and work them out over the shaft. So they come out fairly easily as a unit. I'm gonna leave these like this for a while, because the main purpose is to get a little bit deeper into it and take the axle shaft out. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. And the reason I had to remove that is to expose the fasteners that hold the axle back onto the shaft. So, using the same idea with this access hole, I'm going to go ahead and loosen up all these fasteners here, and then the axle should slide right on out. It'll probably take a little bit of effort because it's been on there for 42 years, but let me get these fasteners loosened and we'll see what we end up with. Okay, we've got all the fasteners around the circumference of the backing plate removed and set aside. And I've got the backing plate loose now, which also contains the axle shaft seal, the outer seal. And what you can do is, since the caliper is removed, is you can tap on it lightly with a small hammer, kind of like that one, and just knock it loose. It'll come off. And now that that's done, what we have to do is find a way to slide the axle back out of here, and that's going to be the most difficult part of the job. You can already see what the problem is. It's already leaking gear oil. Unlike most American cars, it does not use gear oil traveling down the axle tube to lubricate the bearing. There's actually a little chamber inside here. There's an outer seal and then an inner seal that holds a permanently lubricated bearing. But since those seals have failed, we now have axle oil draining out, even greater now because I've got the backing plate off, of course. but that's also why the parking brake shoes were ruined with contamination from the oil. So we got to go ahead and get that axle on out of there and see if we can replace those grease seals. And what I want to try to do is put the tire back on in such a way that I can kind of use that as a slide hammer and see how much force it's going to take to drive that out. These are usually very stubborn to get out of here. It's sort of a semi-press fit arrangement in there, and then in addition to that, it's been in there for 43 years. So let me get all set up and see what we end up with here. Okay, I just got done using the old sledgehammer method with a spare wheel. I've got a spare from an 86 Dodge Diplomat police car, or Grand Fury, and I use that as a surface to drive the axle out with a substantial hammer, sledgehammer, and it had just broken loose, and it's draining oil like you wouldn't believe, which kind of makes me wonder if this is it's not the kind of bearing that has the is lubricated by the axle oil. It very well may be. I don't think it is, but that's an awful lot of oil to be draining out of there if it's not. Anyway, let's get that off of there and see what we got. Okay, now I got that spare wheel off of there, and the axle shaft is ready to come out for the first time in 43 years. Sorry for the quality of the video. It's very cold and very windy out here, but no rest for the weary. Time to get on with it. Just want to work it out really carefully to avoid damaging any of the seals any more than they already are. Just kind of keep an upward pressure on it. Just gradually slide the axle shaft on out. You can see that it's just coated in gear oil, and that makes me wonder if that inner seal is either completely gone or if this is the kind of axle where the bearings are lubricated by the gear oil. We'll only know for sure once we get a little bit further into it. Let me wipe my hands off here so I can hold the camera. So that's what it looks like. Bleeding gear oil like a sieve. And that looks to be some sort of inner race. And there's a seal way back in there. And now we have our axle shaft. And it's got the there's the axle bearing. Feels pretty good. And it's held on there with this special nut, a slot nut. It takes a special tool, so you got to back that off and then get the bearing out. But the bearing so far seems to be in good shape. There's a seal there that has to come out. That's the outer seal. And the seal I showed you in there is the inner seal, so this bearing is going to have to come off in order to get that seal out of there. I don't have a special tool to get this off of here. I could take a screwdriver and try to pound on it in that direction, counterclockwise, just to see if I can bust it loose. But I may end up damaging that bearing getting it off of there. It's just a matter of seeing how tight that really is on that shaft. But anyway, that's sort of the procedure to remove the axle shaft. Not too bad. Just took a lot of persuasion from a hammer, but came right on out with minimal swearing and minimal damage. And now to see what we got going on inside there. See how hard that seal is to replace. Well, now that I got the axle shaft all pulled out of here and this area all cleaned up inside the shaft, you can see the green inner seal here, as well as the mating flange that the axle rides up against. and that gave me a chance to put the axle shaft back on the tire and stand it up on cinder blocks so I can work with it. And the bearing, which you can see here, which is in good shape, is held on by this slot nut, which took me a long time to remove. It's locked in place by this locking ring down here, which I had to pry away the two tabs so I can get it off, and then take a screwdriver, because I don't have the right tool, and knock it loose. This nut was not really very tight, but bending down these tabs on this lock ring was the hardest part. So we can slide the slot nut off, as well as the locking ring. And you can kind of see how that works, how they kind of stake that at the factory. It just kind of acts as a mechanical lock to keep that nut from backing off during use. And then it's got a flattened area on the shaft that prevents that locking ring from turning. And this bearing, unfortunately, is pressed onto the shaft, and it's not going to be easy to get off because I don't have a bearing press or anything. I don't want to destroy the bearing. So what I'm going to have to do is take the axle shaft and the backing plate to a shop and have that pulled off. I'll probably just go ahead and put it in the back of the truck over there and see if I can find somebody that'll have a press that could pull that off for me. The reason I'm doing all this is I want to get this backing plate off of here so I can replace this outer seal, which seems to have failed and ruined the parking brakes. So a lot of work just to replace the seal, but definitely has to be done to keep the car safe. You always want to have a parking brake, and it also gives me a chance to inspect these bearings and see what's going on in there. So I like to think that everything happens for a reason. I didn't know that the parking brake wasn't functioning until the caliper seized up on me, which seemed like a bad problem at the time, but it actually was a blessing in disguise because it exposed all these other problems that have been surfacing over a long time, and it gives me a chance to address those at the same time I can get those calipers fixed. So I'll go ahead and get this bearing pressed off of here and end up doing the same thing to the right side. And then once I get those parts into such a state that I can reassemble them, I'll go ahead and put them back in and continue on with the caliper rebuild and ultimately the brake job, and install new parking shoes and get the parking brakes working again. So I think what I'll do is call this part 1 and stop for now, and until I can research a little bit and see if I can find someone to deal with that bearing for me without destroying it.